Good morning, you're watching World News and I'm your host, Klaudia Czerwińska. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth will meet with his Polish counterpart Władysław Kosiniak-Kamysz in Warsaw on Friday morning. Hegseth on Thursday told NATO defense ministers in Brussels that Europe should be primarily responsible for defense on the continent. In Poland, Hegseth will discuss bilateral defense cooperation between the two countries and the need of continued deterrence efforts along NATO's eastern flank. The U.S. has highlighted Poland's leadership as a model ally in defense investment and burden sharing in NATO. Hegseth will also visit U.S. troops stationed in Poland to discuss their critical role in the region. The eyes of the world are on the capital of Bavaria as the Munich Security Conference kicks off today. The event will focus on topics such as the war in Ukraine, the crisis in the Gaza Strip, and the shifting dynamics of the NATO alliance. The Munich Security Conference is a key platform for discussing transatlantic relations, geopolitical conflicts, and emerging security threats. This year's event takes place amid a range of global tensions, notably the war in Ukraine and in the Middle East. Among the participants of the conference are U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, and President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen. Key meetings will revolve around strategic security, humanitarian aid coordination, and the role of multilateral organizations in resolving conflicts. Beyond the Middle East and Ukraine, other critical topics include the future of NATO, global defense spending, and cybersecurity challenges. Negotiations on a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine will not go ahead without participation of authorities from Kyiv. This is a common refrain coming from attendees at the Munich Security Conference. Asked whether he would compare the Munich Security Conference to the meeting in Yalta, which cemented the Soviet Union's sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski said Ukraine, unlike countries from the past, is both fighting back and has its allies by its side.
Please be careful making historical analogies. We are talking with our allies, having realistic talks, and we're talking with Ukraine, because Ukraine was also present yesterday in Paris. Unlike in the past, this attacked country is fighting back, has agency, and has allies.
German opposition leader Friedrich Merz said that he expects a tough, confrontational speech from U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference, adding that he hopes Europe is prepared to respond. Merz said Europe will likely need to strengthen support for Ukraine or risk losing it to Russia.
I've had some early indications of how Vice President J.D. Vance will be speaking. It will be a confrontational speech, and I very much hope that the Chancellor is prepared, also in coordination with his partners in the European Union, to give a European, not a German, but a European answer. We will remember this security conference in 2025 for a very long time, and it will have consequences. Nevertheless, we are still in the middle of this conflict. We are still faced with the question, how do we help Ukraine? And I predict that starting this weekend, we will have to answer this question even more clearly. And if we don't do that, then we will give up Ukraine, and that won't make Putin stop.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's flight from Washington to Munich was forced to turn back due to a mechanical issue. He will now continue his trip to Germany and the Middle East aboard a different aircraft. Flight issues arose when a crack was discovered in the cockpit windshield of the C-32 plane, a converted Boeing 757, prompting the aircraft to turn back around about 19 minutes into its journey. The Secretary of State is to attend the Munich Security Conference alongside Vice President J.D. Vance, who traveled to Europe separately. Rubio was scheduled to join Vance in a meeting with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky, but it is unclear whether he would arrive in Munich in time for the discussions. U.S. President Donald Trump has said that EU and NATO countries must increase their financial contributions to support Ukraine. He also claimed that the U.S. is bearing a financial burden of $200 billion more than Ukraine's other allies and that these countries need to equalize payments. Trump's statement follows his call with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
We want to have them put up more money. They have to do that At the same time, we had a very good conversation with President Putin yesterday, and we also had a very good conversation. I did in both cases, with President Zelensky. And I think we're going to be able to do something. I think we're going to be able to make a deal. But as far as the negotiation, it's too early to say what's going to happen. Maybe Russia will give up a lot. Maybe they won't. And it's all dependent on what is going to happen. The negotiation really hasn't started.
U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has warned Europe against treating America like a sucker while speaking to reporters at the NATO headquarters in Brussels. Hegseth said the Trump administration is expecting Europe to take primary responsibility for defense on the European continent.
We can talk all we want about values. Values are important. But you can't shoot values. You can't shoot flags. And you can't shoot strong speeches. There is no replacement for hard power. As much as we may not want to like the world we live in some cases, there's nothing like hard power. We have the perfect deal maker at the table from a position of strength to deal with both Vladimir Putin and Zelensky. No one's going to get everything that they want. Understanding who committed the aggression in the first place. But I challenge anyone else to think of a world leader at this moment who, with credibility and strength, could bring those two leaders to the table and forge a durable peace that ultimately serves the interests of Ukraine, stops the killing and the death, which Trump has been clear he wants to do, and hopefully ultimately is guaranteed by strength of Europeans who are there prepared to back it up.
We need to work together in Europe and achieve common results, Volodymyr Zelensky said ahead of the Munich Security Conference in Germany. The Ukrainian president added that he has spoken to the commander-in-chief of the armed forces of Ukraine about strengthening Ukraine's air force.
We are now preparing for meetings and negotiations at the Munich conference, and on the road, I just spoke with Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk and Lithuanian President Gitanas Nausėda. We are coordinating our positions, a joint European defense. This is extremely important, to work together in Europe and achieve common results. I also spoke with the Commander-in-Chief, Alexander Syrsky. We need to strengthen our Air Force, specifically the aviation component, our military aviation. I have instructed the Commander-in-Chief to discuss with Brigadier General Serhiy Holubstov and report on the possibility of corresponding personnel changes in the Air Force, including considering the appointment of Brigadier General Holubstov as Deputy Commander of the Air Force.
It seems like the people of Ukraine did not take too well to Donald Trump's idea of peace negotiations with Russia without Volodymyr Zelensky present. Zarina Zabriskie, a Ukrainian journalist, spoke to civilians and soldiers who are equally disgusted with the idea of negotiations without the involvement of Ukrainian officials.
I interviewed quite a lot of Ukrainians today all around the country. I make a point of speaking to people in different life paths and in different regions, anywhere from Donetsk and Kharkov to all the way in south and in western Ukraine. And pretty much everybody describes this deal as a dirty one, exactly the same words. There's a lot of anger, outrage. I spoke to several militaries, an officer. The emotions range from being in shock to being disgusted. And there's certainly no readiness in Ukraine to accept whatever is going to be brought or imposed on Ukraine in such a manner.
Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk has called on political leaders in Poland to put aside their differences when discussing matters of national security, especially in light of the war and the potential peace in Ukraine. In a social media post, the Polish Prime Minister said that Poland, Europe, and the broader West need cooperation and solidarity in the wake of the U.S. President Donald Trump announcing the commencement of peace talks between Ukraine and Russia. Disagreements about the war and potential peace in Ukraine will have to be put on hold, Tusk said, arguing there's no place for discord in the face of threats coming from Russia. Donald Trump, after talking to leaders of both Ukraine and Russia, said Moscow and Kyiv want to reach a peaceful agreement. Speaking to the Financial Times, Emmanuel Macron said that only the Ukrainian president can negotiate on behalf of his country with Russia. The French leader went on to say that a peace that is capitulation would be bad news for everyone, the U.S. included. In the interview, Macron asked whether Vladimir Putin is genuinely, sustainably and credibly interested in a ceasefire deal and added that if he is, then it is up to the Ukrainians to negotiate with the Kremlin. These remarks come after U.S. President Donald Trump separately discussed the war with Russia and Ukrainian officials and told his administration to open talks on ending the conflict. The phone calls followed U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth telling Ukraine's allies that the return to Ukraine pre-2014 borders was unrealistic, and he does not see it as part of NATO in the coming future. Additionally, Macron told the Financial Times that Donald Trump had created a, quote, window of opportunity for a negotiated solution to the war. At the same time, the French leader said it is now up to Volodymyr Zelensky to discuss territorial and sovereignty issues. The deaths and bloodshed must come to an end, said German Chancellor Olaf Scholz when commenting on Donald Trump's efforts to bring Kyiv and Moscow to the negotiating table. He also commented on the recent attack in Munich, which saw at least 28 people injured after a man drove his car into a crowd.
I have already commented on the terrible attack in Munich this afternoon. I underline every sentence. Consistent action must be taken. The investigations are in full swing. I do not want to anticipate the results. But our thoughts are with the victims and their families. Some of the victims were very, very seriously injured. I'd like to start by saying that President Trump and the Russian president spoke to each other directly yesterday. I have also had repeated talks with the Russian president in the past. It is important to convey to him our expectations for a just peace in Ukraine and a return to the European peace order. A peace order in which borders are not moved by force. I also agree with the American president that the Russian war against Ukraine must end as quickly as possible. The deaths and bloodshed must come to an end. We know that no one longs for peace more than Ukraine. But at the same time, it is absolutely clear a Russian victory or a collapse of Ukraine will not create peace. On the contrary, it would jeopardize peace and stability in Europe, even far beyond Ukraine.
On Thursday, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance said that America would hit Moscow with sanctions should Vladimir Putin not agree to a peace deal with Ukraine. In an interview with the Wall Street Journal, Vance floated the idea of sending American troops to Ukraine if Moscow fails to negotiate in good faith. Vance struck a far tougher tone than his colleague, U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, who suggested that the U.S. will not commit its military to ensure peace in Ukraine. In the interview, the VP claimed that the U.S. has economic tools of leverage and will use its military tools if the situation demands it. Vance's remarks came a day before his meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky at the Munich Security Conference. The American vice president is also scheduled to speak with allied leaders, whom he intends to tell that they are sifting free speech and democracy by not working with populist parties. A man in Munich rammed a car into a crowd on Thursday, injuring at least 28 people. He was later identified as a 24-year-old asylum seeker from Afghanistan.
Adding onto a list of similar attacks in Germany over the last few months, a man in a Mini Cooper car drove into a crowd of people.
The current state of the investigation is that a 24-year-old Afghan is suspected to be the perpetrator who drove a small white vehicle into the crowd.
Eyewitnesses reported seeing the car accelerate prior to colliding with the crowd, prompting local officials to suspect that the incident was a premeditated attack.
One thing I have to say now is that it is probably an attack. There are many indications of that. Everything else has yet to be determined. There's an Afghan citizen. We will clarify all the details.
The victims are childcare employees who are part of the local trade union, Verdi. They were attending an organized rally after negotiations for federal and local public service wages had stalled. The attack took place just a week before Germany's federal election next week, with migration and asylum seekers being one of the most prominent topics of discussions between candidates.
And so this marks the end of our broadcast for now, but please do stay tuned here on TVP World. Back in just a moment with more interviews and features.